The children of the wealthy don't inherit just money. They inherit a completely different operating system for thinking about it. And I don't mean trust funds. I don't mean stock portfolios. What I mean is mental frameworks, ways of interpreting the world that most people never encounter in their entire lives. There is a reason this matters. 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation. 90% lose it by the third. That statistic gets repeated constantly, usually as a cautionary tale about irresponsibility or entitlement. But that explanation misses the point. The money doesn't disappear first. The knowledge does. What failed first usually isn't the portfolio, it was the information transmission. Many parents teach their kids a very specific story about money. It is so common, it is conventional, we barely notice it anymore. You work hard, you trade time for dollars. You get a paycheck, you save a little. As you learn more, you earn more. You invest conservatively. And you retire at 65 or later. That life script isn't entirely wrong, but it is very incomplete. It is optimized for survival, not for wealth creation and preservation. It is designed to help keep you from falling behind, but not to help you pull ahead. It teaches you how not to lose, but doesn't teach you how to win. And fundamentally, those are very different games. Playing not to lose requires one specific set of strategies. Playing to win requires a completely other approach. Different tools, different assumptions, different tolerance for risk. Many people don't realize there is a big difference. They assume if they just follow the traditional advice more carefully, work harder, save more, delay gratification a little bit longer, wealth will eventually appear. That belief is very comforting, and it's mostly wrong. It's just like believing if you jog fast enough, one day you will break the sound barrier. You are not lacking in effort. Most people aren't. You're just using the wrong vehicle to get there. Wealthy families understand this distinction. From a very early age, they teach their kids ideas that compound ideas. These are ideas like leverage, asymmetry of returns, probability, and systems thinking. They don't teach this because they're secrets. It just so happens that most people are never exposed to them until much later in life, if at all. Today, I want to walk through 9 of those lessons. Not so you can lecture your kids or you can memorize them, but because once you internalize them, you stop seeing money as a moral issue or a motivational issue, and you see it for what it is, a mathematical one. Let me start with the first lesson. It sounds extremely simple, almost trivial, but it changes the entire approach. Money is not for spending and buying things we want, although that's what we do with it sometimes. It is for deploying strategically. I once worked with a colleague who came from old money. His grandfather had built a fortune in manufacturing. One afternoon, during a conversation about risk management approaches, he mentioned something his grandfather told him when he was 7 years old. 7. His grandfather said, "Money is like a garden. You don't eat the seeds." At first glance, that sounds like basic advice about saving. But if you look closer, what it's really teaching is that money has 2 distinct functions, and they are consumption and reproduction. If you get the balance wrong, or you get the order wrong, you will have neither eventually. Most people see money and immediately think about what it can buy. The wealthy teach their children to see money as a tool that can also create more money in addition. Deployment becomes primary and spending becomes secondary. This is the first and most foundational shift you need to embrace. When you stop thinking of money as a consumable resource and start thinking of it as a reproductive asset as well, the kind of questions you ask yourself change. You stop asking, what can I afford today? And instead you ask yourself, what can this generate in the future? This is not about being cheap. It is about understanding how things compound. If you spend $1 today, it's gone. Sure, you might have something to show for it. If you deploy that dollar at a reasonable rate of return, it could become 2, then 4, then 8. The difference between those paths, it is not linear, it is exponential. Here's a concrete example. Let's say you got a bonus at work and you have 10 extra $1,000 this year. You're deciding between buying a luxury watch for yourself to reward your efforts or investing the money instead. The watch will give you immediate pleasure, maybe a status. Maybe it even holds some resale value later on. Maybe you feel good looking at it every day as you put it on before your workday starts, as a reminder of the success you have achieved. But 20 years from now, it is still just a nice watch. Now, if you buy yourself a less fancy watch and invest some of those $10,000 at 10% annually over decades, in 20 years, you have $67,000. If you wait a little bit longer, in 30 years, you're gonna have $174,000. The watch will give you gratification. The investment gives you eventual freedom. Wealthy children grow up surrounded by this logic. This is not just something they hear in a math class in high school. Every financial decision is evaluated not just on its immediate utility, but on the long-term generative capacity. That's the operating system. But here's where many people misunderstand the lesson. The wealthy don't just teach their children to save and buy index funds. They teach them to deploy capital into assets that produce income, not just appreciation. Businesses generate cash flow. Real estate generates cash flow. Some intellectual property could generate royalties. The goal isn't a big number on one statement. The goal is ownership of things that pay you whether you work or not. Which brings us directly to the second lesson. Income and wealth are not the same thing. We use these words interchangeably, but they represent entirely different realities. Income is what you earn. Wealth is what you own that earns without you. A doctor making $400,000 a year has high income, but if that doctor stops working, the income stops. That is not wealth. That is just a well-paying job. Now compare that to someone who owns assets producing $100,000 a year in actual real passive income. They don't have to work for it at all. That money shows up whether they work or not. The assets are doing all the work. That is wealth. I learned this distinction not from finance, but from mathematics. In math, there's two different concepts: variables that change and constants that remain the same. Income is always a variable. It will fluctuate with effort, health, employers, markets, your skill set. You can influence it, but you cannot control those things. Wealth behaves more like a constant. Once it is established, it will persist. Your eventual goal is not to create a high-paying job for yourself. It is to build systems that will grow on their own. A machine, something that could generate returns whether you show up or not. That's a huge mindset shift. Job versus machine is everything. High-income earners often miss this distinction. As their income rises, their lifestyle rises with it, even if not as fast. A bigger house, a better car, more expensive vacations, nicer things. They feel wealthy because they can afford more things. But they're still on the same treadmill. The moment they stop running, by choice or by force, the lifestyle collapses. This happens to capable people all the time. Lawyers, surgeons, bankers. They make millions over their careers, yet they saved almost nothing by comparison. Meanwhile, I have seen people with far more modest incomes quietly build wealth, real wealth, in the background. They lived within their limited means. They invested as much as they could. They bought assets that produced income, and over time the math caught up. Wealthy families teach this approach explicitly. As kids get old enough to understand, they will show their children financial statements. They will explain the cash flow. They normalize thinking in terms of assets instead of salaries. By adulthood, the children no longer ask, how much does this job pay? They ask, what does this build? And then comes the third lesson, the one that makes most people deeply uncomfortable. Being liked is expensive. When you optimize for social approval, you make financial decisions emotionally instead of logically. You buy the car your neighbors admire. You pick up the check because you want to seem generous. You lend money you wouldn't get back because saying no feels awkward. And I don't mean you should hoard it. If you want to help somebody, by all means do so. Each of those decisions has a real cost. And over a lifetime, those costs add up in the wrong direction. Wealthy families teach their children that respect is more valuable than being liked. And respect can only come from competence and healthy boundaries. If you look close enough, you will see this pattern repeatedly. The most successful investors are rarely the most popular. They say no constantly. They avoid every single obligation that doesn't serve their own goals. They will make decisions many people will criticize, but they're still respected because they are effective. There is a simple mathematical principle underneath this. All of your resources, whether it's time, money, or attention, they are finite. Every yes to something unwise is a no to something beneficial. When you allocate resources to gain approval, you are not allocating them to things that add up. Let me give you a specific example. Early in my career, I had a colleague who was from working class background, and he worked his way into a comfortable income. He was generous to a fault. Family needed money, he gave it. Friends had business ideas, he invested in those ideas. Colleagues wanted to go somewhere expensive, he joined along every time. Everyone loved him, everyone thought he was successful. 20 years later, he had almost nothing saved. And other people are known for being tight with money. They rarely go out. They never pick up the group check. People will call them cheap, but if they invest systematically, build rental properties, most of those people by their 50s are financially independent. The lesson isn't cruelty, it is to establish healthy, founded boundaries. Wealthy families teach their kids that protecting resources is not a selfish act. It is necessary. If you don't protect them, you wouldn't be able to help anyone in the long run, including yourself. And that leads directly to the fourth lesson, which is about information, but not the information the way most people think about it. The fourth lesson wealthy families teach their kids is that profit lives in the margins of information asymmetry. Even if they never use that phrase explicitly, they teach their kids that what you know that other peoples do not is where advantage comes from. Every single edge in investing, in business, in negotiations, in life comes from possessing insight that is not evenly distributed across other competitors. Everybody wants to do well for themselves. You don't need to be smarter than everyone else to succeed. You don't even necessarily need to work harder than everyone else. What you need to have is a different relationship with information. You have to look at aspects that many other people will ignore, either because they don't know what to look for or they consider it inapplicable and trivial. Over time, you will notice patterns that other people cannot see. You will find many things in plain sight that will help you if you just look. This difference creates asymmetry. Wealthy families teach their kids to pursue this kind of knowledge and information early. Not the trivia, not the surface level facts. Actionable intelligence. They teach them how to read and structure a financial statement. They teach them to understand basic tax structures and benefits of each, and the drawbacks. To recognize business cycles and cycles in the markets. They teach them that information is a form of currency and that the return of investing in the knowledge always exceeds the return on investing in physical assets or financial instruments. I once randomly had a conversation with somebody whose family has been wealthy for 4 generations. He told me that in his family growing up, every single Sunday dinner included a ritual. Every child in the family had to share one thing they learned this week that nobody else at the table already knew. It wasn't about showing off. And obviously, adults knew a lot more than the kids did at that dinner table. It was about building a habit. Over many years and decades, that habit amplifies your ability. It trains children to seek information actively rather than passively, the way it happens in most schools. It teaches them that learning doesn't end with school. It teaches them that learning is something you can control and influence. It teaches them that learning is something you can pursue deliberately. By the time those kids reach adulthood, they've spent years practicing how to identify valuable information and how to apply it to real decisions in the everyday. They're no longer thinking about it as something they have to do. That's just their baseline now. This creates an enormous advantage. The more you know, the better decisions you make. The better decisions you make, the more resources you're able to get. And those resources get reinvested into learning. The cycle is self-perpetuating. But there's an important filter here that matters. The wealthy teach their children that not all knowledge is equal and the same. Celebrity gossip doesn't compound. Sports statistics don't create any kind of leverage. But knowing how incentives work and how they can be structured is important. Knowing how tax law changes affect asset classes in your portfolio does. Knowing how to read a financial statement, balance sheets, and long-term trends does. They teach ruthless selectivity. They teach their kids to read widely but strategically. They focus on learning knowledge that travels across contexts, knowledge that builds on itself, knowledge that improves judgment, knowledge that can be applied to many domains once it's learned. They teach their kids to be always willing to spend money on books, on courses, on expert advice because they can learn more from others. The right piece of information at the right time from the right person can generate returns that dwarf its cost. The wealthy teach that instinct early, which leads me to the fifth lesson, one that goes against almost every parental instinct. Comfort is always the enemy. And I don't mean the physical comfort. Of course, we need that. What I mean is the comfort of certainty, comfort of a routine, of predictability. Most parents want their children to feel safe, stable job, steady income, clear path forward. The wealthy want their children to grow, and growth cannot happen in comfort. Every meaningful breakthrough in my life came from being uncomfortable, starting something without guarantees, pursuing an interest that others criticized, making decisions in my day-to-day life that my friends couldn't relate to or understand. Each move forced me to learn faster, think harder, and adapt more creatively than the comfort would ever have allowed me. Wealthy families teach their children to seek discomfort, but strategically. They push them early into situations where failure is possible, where outcomes aren't guaranteed. They give them projects with real stakes. They don't rush in to shield them from the small consequences early on. Learning happens at the edge of your ability, not at the center of your comfort zone. Innovation never happens through massive leaps. It happens through small steps into unexplored territory, little by little. Comfort is going to keep you anchored to what is known, what works today. Discomfort pushes you into the adjacent possible, where discovery lives. You will see this in how wealthy families handle education and careers for their kids. They don't push children exclusively towards safe corporate tracks where they can grow into the middle management and be successful. They encourage entrepreneurship. They will fund small ventures that will fail. They will treat this failure as tuition, not a catastrophe. But here's the nuance many people miss. They teach strategic discomfort, not recklessness. There is a fundamental difference between stepping outside your comfort zone with a plan and throwing yourself into a chaos you have to navigate by the seat of your pants. The wealthy teach their children to take the risks that they can afford to fail at, to test ideas with a limited downside, to fail in ways early that produce learning without destroying the baseline. They teach their children to test strategies with small amount of money first, to figure out what works and what doesn't. It is uncomfortable, but it isn't reckless. That balance is taught. It is not intuitive. You can't develop it by reading a book. Which brings me to the sixth lesson. And this one changes how you see your everyday. Time does not have a uniform value. Most people treat time as completely interchangeable. An hour is an hour. That is intuitive and mathematically absurd. An hour spent learning a skill that compounds over decades is worth infinitely more than an hour spent on a task someone else could do better than you for 20 bucks. The wealthy teach their children to ask this question constantly. Is this the highest value use of my time right now? They teach to delegate strategically and aggressively. The difference isn't intelligence, it is time valuation. This lesson extends far beyond work. Wealthy families teach their kids to be selective about social obligations, about their hobbies, even relationships. Not because they're cold and calculating, but because they understand something most people don't. You often can make more money. You can never create more time. Every hour spent on something low value is an hour permanently removed from something of high value. That opportunity cost adds up over years and decades invisibly in the background. For me, I learned this lesson much later in life than I should have. And once I did, everything else changed. My trajectory shifted dramatically. I started declining invitations without guilt. I hired people to handle tasks I could do well enough, but I wasn't uniquely qualified to do. I focused my all energy on the narrow set of activities where I could create disproportionate value in my life. It made no sense to do my own taxes late into the evening and then be tired the entire next day. The result wasn't just better efficiency, it was better outcomes across the board. The wealthy teach their kids to think about time in terms of leverage. Can this hour generate value long after it's over? Writing down a system or a blueprint, building on a new budding relationship, creating intellectual property, learning a new skill, or does the value creation stops when the hour ends? This one distinction applied consistently is going to reshape your entire life. They also teach their children to protect time aggressively, to set boundaries, to structure their schedules around priorities instead of other people's urgencies and priorities. Because if you don't control your time, someone else will, and they will optimize it for their goals and not yours. Which brings us to the seventh lesson, and this one completely inverts how most people think about mistakes. If you're able to separate failure from identity, you will begin seeing it as simply a data point. Most people experience failure as a verdict. It's final. I failed. The label sticks and the shame follows. Shame leads to avoidance, and avoidance is going to prevent you from learning and improving. Wealthy families teach as a foundation a completely different framing. What approach failed? What did you learn? There is a subtle shift to this. You cannot undo a failure that already happened, but you can avoid a future failure by learning from it. Over the course of your entire life, most of your strategies are not going to work out the first time. Most of your beliefs are going to start out being wrong. But if you treat each failure as an experiment, if you deconstruct it, if you reassess your assumptions, if you just have enough courage to give it another go, over time, those little failures are going to accumulate into a massive database of what doesn't work, which is almost as valuable as knowing what does. It's going to allow you to avoid all the pitfalls that other people fall prey to. The wealthy people teach their children to fail. Fail fast and fail cheap. They teach them not to bet everything on one big idea. They teach them to run many small experiments. They teach them to expect the vast majority of those experiments to fail miserably, to recognize the ones that don't, and then scale those to great success. Most people do the exact opposite. They will place one huge bet, tie their identity to it, and when it inevitably fails, they're wiped out financially and emotionally. There is this mathematical concept called expected future value. If you run enough micro experiments with positive expected future value, the wins will eventually outweigh all the losses combined, but only if you can survive the losses. That's the key. Survival. The failure can only become terminal when it's oversized. The wealthy teach their children that mistakes are part of the process. It is not a referendum on worth. It is not a competence question. It is a skill question, and skills can be acquired with effort. This one mindset guarantees mediocrity, fear of failure. You never start, you never test your hypothesis, and you never expose your ideas to reality. The wealthy teach the exact opposite. Fail fast, fail forward, fail often, but extract the lessons from each failure and keep moving forward. Some of the most successful people I personally know have the longest list of failures. The difference that makes them successful is they never stopped. And that brings us to the eighth lesson, which is about people. But not people the way social media talks about them. The eighth lesson wealthy families teach their kids is that your network will offer you leverage, but not in the shallow sense of collecting contacts and knowing famous names you can name drop. They teach something a lot more systematic. The relationships in general are a form of an asset, not because of status, but because of access to skills, to information, to judgment, and opportunities you don't personally possess. The wealthy teach their kids to ask very practical questions. Who do you know that understands real estate? Who understands complex tax law? Who has built a business in the industry you're targeting? Who is 87 years old but can see around corners better than you can? This sounds transactional at the first glance, and it is in a sense, but it isn't exploitative. The foundation of all that is reciprocity. You don't extract value from a network. You contribute to it. You make introductions. You share your own insights with others. You help others win first, and in return, eventually, they will help you win as well. Over time, you end up a node in a large system of high-performing, self-driven, mutually supportive folks. These relationships are going to be built over the years of collaboration, curiosity, and shared problem solving in your domain. The network becomes invaluable as soon as you try to do something moderately complicated. Wealthy families teach their kids to invest in relationships long before they need them. This is key. They teach them to be genuinely useful to others, to show up offering value up front, to understand that the very best time to create and build and expand your network is when you don't need one at all, when you're thriving. And there's another layer to this lesson that matters even more. They teach selectivity, not in a snobbish sense, but in a strategic one. Your peer group is going to affect your thinking. It's going to shape your habits. It's going to influence the sense of what's possible for you. If you spend your time with people who think small, you will unconsciously shrink your own ambitions to match. If you spend time with people who normalize excellence, your internal standard has no choice but to rise up. You will see this repeatedly in some circles. People who break out of their socioeconomic background almost always do it by changing their environment first. They join organizations where they will meet people operating at a much higher level. They will either seek out mentors who achieved what they want to achieve, or they will be informally mentored because that's how those groups operate. They help each other. They immerse themselves into contexts where success is normal and expected. Wealthy families teach this explicitly. They send their kids to schools where they'll meet other driven families. They involve them in activities where high performance is expected. They teach them to seek relationships that expand their thinking rather than reinforce their own self-imposed limitations. And that brings us to the ninth and final lesson. Money is a tool for freedom, not a scorecard for success. The purpose of wealth isn't to maximize a number on the screen. It's to maximize choice. Every dollar of passive income is a unit of freedom. It's time you don't have to sell back to the marketplace. It's leverage you can use in the future. It's a risk you can afford to take. It is your ability to walk away from situations that don't align with your values and interests. Wealthy families teach their kids to optimize for independence, not for luxury. Independence means you can leave a bad job or the one you no longer like, to fund the project you feel passionate about, to support causes you believe in, to say no without fear. They teach their kids not to confuse accumulation with fulfillment. They teach their kids to optimize for autonomy, not for comparison. The finish line isn't a balance sheet. It's the moment money stops being a constraint on how you spend your time. Once you see that, your own decisions will change. You will care less about status symbols and more about income-producing assets. You'll end up caring less about titles and more about control. You will spend less on things that depreciate and more on things that appreciate. You will measure success not by what you own or can afford to purchase, but how much choice you truly have. Wealthy families make this concrete for their kids. They teach them to calculate their freedom number. They teach them to learn how much passive income is going to cover your basics. How much do you need to have a comfortable life? How much you need to have to fund your ambitions, wherever they are. Once you know those numbers, wealth stops being this abstract thing in the ether. Now you're able to work backwards. What assets do you need to acquire? What returns are required? Are they reasonable? What would be a realistic timeline? Wealth building becomes a plan, not just a wish. Now, before we wrap up, I want you to pause for a moment and think for yourself about these 9 lessons. Not all of them, just one. The one that made you the most uncomfortable. The one that challenged how you already think. That discomfort is the signal. Pick that one lesson and try to apply it deliberately in your own life over the next month or so, not as a vague intention, but as a concrete action you can take, whether it's a boundary you set, a habit you change, a system you design. Because knowledge without application is just entertainment. The wealthy don't just understand these ideas, they implement them daily for decades. That is what ultimately creates generational wealth. And here's another part many people miss. None of these lessons are secret. They aren't hidden, nobody locked them away. They are simply ways of thinking that most people are never taught. They teach their kids that money is for deploying, not just spending. That income and wealth are worlds apart. That social approval is expensive and information is invaluable. That you cannot have growth without discomfort. That you need to leverage your time. That failure is just a data point. Nobody succeeds the first 10 times they try something new. That networks matter. And that money exists precisely to buy time freedom. These aren't just financial principles, they are life principles. They govern how you allocate your most valuable resources, your energy, your money, your time, and your attention. And the most important part is this. You don't need to be born into wealth to use these principles. All you need is a willingness to think differently, to make decisions based on logic rather than emotions, on crude mathematics rather than social pressure, to test ideas, to follow your results, and adjust when you're wrong. Not luck, not pedigree, systems, experiments, and compounding. Your success is not going to happen overnight. Compounding only works with a long enough timeline. But even if you pick just 3 or 4 of these lessons and apply them consistently over the next decade, your life will look nothing like it does today. Not because you got lucky, because you thought differently. And that's the real inheritance wealthy families pass down. Not just money, a way of seeing the world. Thank you.